Abdullah had never been to Kabul. What he knew about Kabul came from stories Uncle Nabi had told him. He had visited a few smaller towns on jobs with father, but never a real city, and certainly nothing Uncle Nabi had said could have prepared him for the hustle and bustle of the biggest and busiest city of them all. Everywhere he saw traffic lights and tea houses and restaurants and glass fronted shops with bright multicolored signs. Cars rattling noisily down the crowded streets, hooting, darting narrowly among buses, pedestrians, and bicycles. Horse-drawn garis jingled up and down boulevards, their iron-rimmed wheels bouncing on the road. The sidewalks he walked with Pari and father were crowded with cigarette and chewing gum sellers, magazine stands, blacksmiths pounding horseshoes. At intersections, traffic policemen in ill-fitting uniforms blew their whistles and made authoritative gestures that no one seemed to heed. Pari on his lap, Abdullah sat on a sidewalk bench near a butcher's shop, sharing a tin plate of baked beans and cilantro chutney that father had bought them from a street stall. Look, Abdullah, Pari said, pointing to a shop across the street. In its window stood a young woman dressed in a beautifully embroidered green dress with small mirrors and beads. She wore a long matching scarf with silver jewelry and deep red trousers. She stood perfectly still, gazing indifferently at passers-by without once blinking. She didn't move so much as a finger as Abdullah and Pari finished their beans and remained motionless after that too. Up the block, Abdullah saw a huge poster hanging from the facade of a tall building. It showed a young, pretty Indian woman in a tilly field, standing in a downpour of rain, ducking playfully behind some kind of bungalow. She was grinning slyly, a wet sari hugging her curves. Abdullah wondered if this was what Uncle Nabi had called a cinema, where people went to watch films, and hoped that in the coming month Uncle Nabi would take him and Pari to see a film. He grinned at the thought. It was just after the call to prayer played from a blue-tiled mosque up the street that Abdullah saw Uncle Nabi pull up to the curb. Uncle Nabi swung out of the driver's side, dressed in his olive suit, his door narrowly missing a young bicycle rider in a tapan, who swerved just in time. Uncle Nabi hurried around the front of the car and impressed father. When he saw Abdullah and Pari, his face erupted in a big grin. He stooped to be on the same level as them. How do you like Kabul, kids? It's very loud, Buddy said, and Uncle Nabi laughed. That it is. Come on, climb in. You'll see a lot more in it from the car. Wipe your feet before you get in. Sabur, you take the front. The back seat was cool, hard, and light blue to match the exterior. Abdullah slid across it to the window behind the driver's seat and helped Pari onto his lap. He noticed the envious way bystanders looked at the car. Pari swiveled her head toward him, and they exchanged a grin. They watched the city stream by as Uncle Nabi drove. He said he would take a longer route so they could see a little of Kabul. He pointed to a res called Tapa Maranjan and to the dome-shaped mausoleum atop it overlooking the city. He said Nadir Shah, father to King Zahir Shah, was buried there. He showed them the Bala Hisar fort atop the Koisir Dawaza mountain, which he said the British had used during their second war against Afghanistan. What's that, Uncle Nabi? Abdullah tapped on the window, pointing to a big rectangular yellow building. That's Silo, the new bread factory. Uncle Nabi drove with one hand and craned back to wink at him. Compliments of our friends, the Russian. A factory that makes bread? Abdullah marveled, picturing Parwana back in Sadbak slapping slabs of dough against the sides of their mud tandoor. Eventually, Uncle Nabi turned onto a clean, wide street lined with regularly spaced cypress trees. The homes here were elegant and bigger than any Abdullah had ever seen. They were white, yellow, light blue. Most had a couple stories, were surrounded by high walls and closed off by double metal gates. Abdullah spotted several cars like Uncle Nabi's parked along the street. Uncle Nabi pulled up to a driveway decked by a row of neatly trimmed bushes. Beyond the driveway, the white-walled two-story home loomed impossibly large. Your house is so big, Pari breathed, eyes rolling wide with wonderment. Uncle Nabi's head rolled back on his shoulder as he laughed. That would be something. No, this is my employer's home. You're about to meet them. Be on your best manners now. The house proved even more impressive once Uncle Nabi led Abdullah, Pari, and father inside. Abdullah estimated its size big enough to contain at least half the homes in Sadbagh. He felt as though he had stepped into the Deep's palace. The garden at the far back was beautifully landscaped, with rows of flowers in all colors, neatly trimmed with knee-high bushes and papered with fruit trees. Abdullah recognized cherry, apple, apricot, and pomegranate. A roofed porch led into the garden from the house. Uncle Nabi said it was called a veranda and was enclosed by a low railing covered with webs of green vines. On their way to the room where Mr. and Mrs. Wadati awaited their arrival, Abdullah spied a bathroom with the porcelain toilet Uncle Nabi had told them about, as well as a glittering sink with bronze colored faucets. Abdullah, who spent hours every week logging buckets of water from Sadbak's communal well, marveled at a life where water was just a twist of the hand away. Now they sat on a bulky couch with gold tassels, Abdullah, Pari, and father. The soft cushions at their back were dotted with tiny octagonal mirrors. Across from the couch, a single painting took up most of the wall. It showed an elderly stone carver bent over his workbench, pounding a block of stone with a mallet. Pleated burgundy drapes dressed the wide windows that opened onto the balcony with a high waist iron railing. Everything in the room was polished, free of dust. Abdullah had never in his life been so conscious of his own dirtiness. Uncle Nabi's boss, Mr. Wadati, sat on a leather chair, arms crossed over his chest. He was looking at them with an expression that was not quite unfriendly, but remote, impenetrable. He was taller than father. Abdullah had seen that as soon as he had stood to greet them. He had narrow shoulders, thin lips, and a high, shiny forehead. He was wearing a white suit tapered at the waist, with an open collared green shirt whose cuffs were held together by oval shaped lapis stone. The whole time he hadn't said more than a dozen words. Pari was looking down at the plate of cookies on the glass table before them. Abdullah had never imagined such a variety of them existed. Finger shaped chocolate cookies with swirls of cream, small round ones with an orange filling in the center, green cookies shaped like leaves, and more. Would you like one? Mrs. Wadati said. She was the one doing all the talking. Go ahead, both of you. I put them out for you. Abdullah turned to father for permission, and Pori followed suit. This seemed to charm Mrs. Wadati, who tinted her eyebrows, tilted her head, and smiled. Father nodded lightly. One each, he said in a low voice. Oh, that won't do, Mrs. Wadati said. I had Navi go to a bakery halfway across Kabul for this. Father Frost averted his eyes. He was sitting on the edge of the couch, holding his battered skull cap with both hands. He had angled his knees away from Mrs. Wadati and kept his eyes on her husband. Abdullah plucked two cookies and gave one to Pari. Oh, take another. We don't want Nabi's troubles to go to waste, Mrs. Wadati said with cheerful reproach. She smiled at Uncle Nabi. It was no trouble at all, Uncle Nabi said, blushing. Uncle Nabi was standing near the door, beside a tall wooden cabinet with thick glass doors. On the shelves inside, Abdullah saw silver-framed photos of Mr. and Mrs. Wadati. There they were, alongside another couple, dressed in thick scarves and heavy coats, a river flowing foamily behind them. In another picture, Mrs. Wadati holding a glass, laughing, her bare arm around the waist of a man who, unthinkably to Abdullah, was not Mr. Wadati. There was a wedding photo as well. He tall and trim in a black suit, she in a flowing white dress, both of them smiling with their mouths closed. Abdullah stole a glance at her thin waist, her small, pretty mouth, and perfectly arched eyebrows, her pink toenails and matching lipstick. He remembered her now from a couple of years earlier, when Pari had almost been 2. Uncle Nabi had brought her to Sadbagh because she had said she wanted to meet his family. She had worn a pitch dress without sleeves. He remembered the look of astonishment on father's face, and dark sunglasses with thick white rims. She smiled the whole time, asking questions about the village, their lives, asking after the children's names and ages. She acted like she belonged there in their low-ceilinged mud house, her back against the wall, black with soot, sitting next to the fly-specked window and the cloudy plastic seat. that separated the main room from the kitchen, where Abdullah and Pari also slept. She had made a show of the visit, insisting on taking off her high-heeled shoes at the door, choosing the floor when father had sensibly offered her a chair, like she was one of them. He was only 8 then, but Abdullah had seen through it. What Abdullah remembered most about the visit was how Parwana, who had been pregnant with Iqbal then, had remained a shrouded figure sitting in a corner in stiff silence, shriveled up into a ball. She had sat with her soldiers gathered, feet tucked beneath her swollen belly, like she was trying to disappear into the wall. Her face was shielded from view with a soiled vial. She held a knotted clump of it under her chin. Abdullah could almost see the steam rising from her, like steam, the embarrassment, how small she felt, and he had felt a surprising swell of sympathy for his stepmother. Mrs. Wadati reached for the pack next to the cookie plate and lit herself a cigarette. We took a long detour on the way, and I showed them a little of the city. Uncle Nabi said, "Good, good," Mrs. Wadati said. "Have you been to Kabul before, Sabur?" Father said, "Once or twice, Bibi Sahib." "And may I ask, what is your impression?" Father shrugged. "It's very crowded." "Yes." Mr. Wadati picked at a speck of lint on the sleeve of his jacket and looked down at the carpet. "Crowded, yes, and at times tiresome as well," his wife said. Father nodded as if he understood. Kabul is an island, really. Some say it's progressive, and that may be true. It's true enough, I suppose, but it's also out of touch with the rest of this country. Father looked down at the skull cap in his hand and blinked. "Don't misunderstand me," she said. "I would wholeheartedly support any progressive agenda coming out of the city. God knows this country could use it. Still, the city is sometimes a little too pleased with itself for my taste. I swear the pomposity in this place," she sighed. "It does grow tiresome. I have always admired the countryside myself. I have a great fondness for it. The distant provinces, the Karyas, the small villages, the real Afghanistan, so to speak." Father nodded uncertainly. "I may not agree with all or even most of the tribal traditions, but it seems to me that out there people live more authentic lives. They have a sturdiness about them, a refreshing humility, hospitality too, and resilience, a sense of pride. Is that the right word, Suleiman? Pride?" "Stop it, Neela," her husband said quietly. A dense silence followed. Abdullah watched Mr. Wadati drumming his fingers on the arm of his chair, and his wife smiling tightly, the pink smudge on the butt end of her cigarette, her feet crossed at the ankles, her elbow resting on the arm of the chair. "Probably not the right word," she said, breaking the silence. "Dignity, perhaps." She smiled, revealing teeth that were straight and white. Abdullah had never seen teeth like this. "That's it. Much better. People in the countryside carry a sense of dignity. They wear it, don't they? Like a badge. I'm being genuine. I see it in you, Sabur." "Thank you, Bibi Sahib," father muttered, sitting on the couch, still looking down at his skull cap. Mrs. Wadati nodded. She turned her gaze to Pari. "And may I say, you are so lovely." Pari nudged closer to Abdullah. Slowly, Mrs. Wadati recited. "Today I have seen the charm, the beauty, the unfathomable grace of the face that I was looking for." She smiled. "Rumi, have you heard of him? You'd think he had composed it just for you, my dear." "Mrs. Wadati is an accomplished poet," Uncle Nabi said. Across the room, Mr. Wadati reached for a cookie, split it in half, and took a small bite. "Nabi is being kind," Mrs. Wadati said, casting him a warm glance. Abdullah again caught a flush creeping up Uncle Nabi's cheek. Mrs. Wadati crushed her cigarette, giving the butt a series of sharp taps against the ashtray. "Maybe I could take the children somewhere," she said. Mr. Wadati let out a breath huffily, slapped both palms against the arms of his chair, and made as if to get up, though he didn't. "I'll take them to bazaar," Mrs. Wadati said to father now. "If that's all right with you, Sabur. Nabi will drive us. Suleiman can show you the walkside out back, so you can see it for yourself." Father nodded. Mr. Wadati's eyes slowly fell shut. They got up to go. Suddenly, Abdullah wished father would thank these people for their cookies and tea, take his hand and Pari's, and leave this house and its paintings and drapes and overstuffed luxury and comfort. They could refill their water bag, buy bread and a few boiled eggs, and go back the way they had come, back through the desert, the boulders, the hills, father telling them stories. They would take turns pulling Pari in the wagon, and in 2, maybe 3 days' time, though there would be dust in their lungs and tiredness in their limbs, they would be back in South Park again. Suza would see them coming, and he would hurry over, prance circles around Pari. They would be home. Father said, "Go on, children." Abdullah took a step forward, meaning to say something, but then Uncle Nabi's thick hand was on his shoulder, turning him around, Uncle Nabi leading him down the hallway, saying, "Wait till you see the bazaars in this place. You have not seen the likes of it, you too." Mrs. Wadati sat in the back seat with them, the air filled with the thick weight of her perfume and something Abdullah didn't recognize, something sweet, a little pungent. She peppered them with questions as Uncle Nabi drove. Who were their friends? Did they go to school? Questions about their chores, their neighbors, games they played. The sun fell on the right half of her face. Abdullah could see the fuzzy little hairs on her cheek and the faint line below her jaw where the makeup ended. "I have a dog," Pari said. "Do you? He's quite the specimen," Uncle Nabi said from the front seat. "His name is Suza. He knows when I'm sad." "Dogs are like that," Mrs. Wadati said. "They are better at it than some people I've come across." They drove past a trio of schoolgirls skipping down the sidewalk. They wore black uniforms with white scarves tied under their chins. "I know what I said earlier, but Kabul isn't that bad." Mrs. Wadati toyed with her necklace absently. She was looking out the window, a heaviness set on her features. "I like it best here at the end of spring, after the rains. The air so clean, that first burst of summer, the way the sun hits the mountains." She smiled wanly. "It will be good to have a child around the house. A little noise, for a change, a little life." Abdullah looked at her and sensed something alarming in the woman. Beneath the makeup and the perfume and the appeals for sympathy, something deeply splintered. He found himself thinking of the smoke of Parvana's cooking, the kitchen shelf cluttered with her jars and mismatched plates and smudged pots. He missed the mattress he shared with Pari, though it was dirty, and the jumbles of springs forever threatened to poke through. He missed all of it. He had never before ached so badly for home. Mrs. Vadati slumped back into the seat with a sigh, hugging her purse the way a pregnant woman might hold her swollen belly. Uncle Nabi pulled up to a crowded curbside. Across the street, next to a mosque with soaring minarets, was the bazaar, composed of congested labyrinths of both vaulted and open alleyways. They strolled through corridors of stalls that sold leather coats, rings with colored jewels, and stones, spices of all kinds. Uncle Nabi in the rear, Mrs. Wadati and the two of them in the lead. Now that they were outside, Mrs. Wadati wore a pair of dark glasses that made her face look oddly cat-like. Hagglers' calls echoed everywhere. Music played from virtually every stall. They walked past open-fronted shops selling books, radios, lamps, and silver-colored cooking pots. Abdullah saw a pair of soldiers in dusty boots and dark brown grey coat, sharing a cigarette, eyeing everyone with bored indifference. They stopped by a shoe stall. Mrs. Vadati rummaged through the rows of shoes displayed on boxes. Uncle Nabi wandered over to the next stall, hands clasped behind his back, and gave a down-the-nose look at some old coins. "How about this?" Mrs. Vadati said to Pari. She was holding up a new pair of yellow sneakers. "They are so pretty," Pari said, looking at the shoes with disbelief. "Let's try them on." Mrs. Wadati helped Pari slip on the shoes, walking the strap and buckle for her. She peered up at Abdullah over her glasses. "You could use a pair too, I think. I can't believe you walked all the way from your village in those sandals." Abdullah shook his head and looked away. Down the alleyway, an old man with a ragged beard and two club feet begged passerby. "Look, Abdullah!" Pari raised one foot, then the other. She stomped her feet on the ground, hopped. Mrs. Wadati called Uncle Nabi over and told him to walk Pari down the alley, see how the shoes felt. Uncle Nabi took Pari's hand and led her up to the lane. Mrs. Wadati looked down at Abdullah. "You think I'm a bad person," she said, "the way I spoke earlier." Abdullah watched Pari and Uncle Nabi pass by the old beggar with the club feet. The old man said something to Pari. Pari turned her face up to Uncle Nabi and said something, and Uncle Nabi tossed the old man a coin. Abdullah began to cry soundlessly. "Oh, you sweet boy," Mrs. Wadati said, startled. "You poor darling." She fetched a handkerchief from her purse and offered it. Abdullah swiped it away. Please don't do it, he said, his voice cracking. She hunkered down beside him now, her glasses pushed up on her hair. There was wetness in her eyes too, and when she dabbed at them with the handkerchief, it came away with black smudges. I don't blame you if you hate me. It's your right. But and I don't expect you to understand. Not now. This is for the best. It really is, Abdullah. It's for the best. One day you'll see. Abdullah turned his fist up to the sky and wailed just as Pari came skipping back to him, her eyes dripping with gratitude, her face shining with happiness. One morning that winter, father fetched his axe and cut down the giant oak tree. He had Mullah Sekib's son, Baitullah, and a few other men help him. No one tried to intervene. Abdullah stood alongside other boys and watched the man. The very first thing father did was take down the swing. He climbed the tree and cut the ropes with a knife. Then he and the other men hacked away at the thick trunk until late afternoon, when the old tree finally toppled with a massive groan. Father told Abdullah they needed the firewood for winter, but he had swung his axe at the old tree with violence, with his jaw firmly set and a cloud over his face, like he couldn't bear to look at it any longer. Now, beneath the stone-colored sky, men were striking at the felled trunk, their noses and cheeks flushed in the cold, their blades echoing hollowly when they hit the wood. Farther up the tree, Abdullah snapped small branches off the big ones. The first of the winter snow had fallen 2 days ago, not heavy, not yet, only a promise of things to come. Soon winter would descend on Sudbag, winters and its icicles and week-long snowdrifts and winds that cracked the skin on the back of hands in a minute flat. For now the white on the ground was scant, pocked from here to the steep hillsides, with pale brown blotches of earth. Abdullah gathered an armful of slim branches and carried them to a growing communal pile nearby. He was wearing his new snow boots, gloves, and winter coat. It was second hand, but other than the broken jeeper, which father had fixed, it was as good as new. Padded, dark blue with orange fur lining inside. It had four deep pockets that snapped open and shut, and a quilted hood that tightened around Abdullah's face when he drew its skirts. He pushed back the hood from his head now and let out a long, foggy breath. The sun was dropping into the horizon. Abdullah could still make out the old windmill looming stark and grey over the village's mud wall. Its blades gave a creaky groan whenever a nippy gust blew in from the hills. The windmill was home mainly to blue herons in the summer, but now that winter was here, the herons had gone and the crows had moved in. Every morning Abdullah woke up to their quacks and harsh croaks. Something caught his eyes, off to his right, on the ground. He walked over to it and knelt down. A feather, small, yellow. He took off one glove and picked it up. Tonight they were going to a party. He, his father, and his little half-brother Iqbal. Baitullah had a new infant boy. A mortar would sing for the men, and someone would tap on a tambourine. There would be tea and warm, freshly baked bread and sorwa soup with potatoes. Afterward, Mullah Sekib would dip his fingers in a bowl of sweetened water and let the baby suckle it. He would produce a shiny black stone and his double-edged razor, lift the cloth from the boy's midriff, an ordinary ritual, life rolling on in Sadbag. Abdullah turned the feather over in his hand. I won't have any crying, father had said. No crying. I won't have it. And there hadn't been any. No one in the village asked after Pari. No one even spoke her name. It astonished Abdullah how thoroughly she had vanished from their lives. Only in Susa did Abdullah find a reflection of his own grief. The dog turned up at their door every day. Parwana threw rocks at him. Father went at him with a stick, but he kept returning. Every night he could be heard whimpering mournfully, and every morning they found him lying by the door, chin on his front paws, blinking up at his assailants with melancholy, unaccusing eyes. This went on for weeks, until one morning Abdullah saw him hobbling towards the hills, head hung low. No one in Sadbag had seen him since. Abdullah pocketed the yellow feather and began walking toward the windmill. Sometimes, in unguarded moments, he caught father's face clouding over, drawn into confusing sets of emotion. Father looked diminished to him now, stripped of something essential. He lopped sluggishly, about the house or else sat in the heat of their big new cast iron stove, little Iqbal on his lap, and stared unseeingly into the flames. His voice dragged now in a way that Abdullah did not remember, as though something waked on each word he spoke. He shrank into long silences, his face closed off. He didn't tell stories anymore, had not told one since he and Abdullah had returned from Kabul. Maybe Abdullah thought father had sold the what that is his muse as well. Gone, vanished, nothing left, nothing said, other than these words from Parwana. It had to be her. I'm sorry, Abdullah. She had to be the one. The finger cut to save the hand. He knelt on the ground behind the windmill at the base of the decaying stone tower. He took off his gloves and dug at the ground. He thought of her heavy eyebrows and her wide, rounded forehead, her gap-toothed smile. He heard in his head the tinkle of her laughter rolling around the house like it used to. He thought of the scuffle that had broken out when they had come back from the bazaar. Pari panicking, shrieking, Uncle Nabi quickly whisking her away. Abdullah dug until his fingers struck metal. Then he maneuvered his hands underneath and lifted the tin tea box from the hole. He swiped cold dirt off the lid. Lately, he thought a lot about the story father had told him the night before the trip to Kabul. The old peasant Baba Ayub and the Dev. Abdullah would find himself on a spot where Pari had once stood, her absence like a smell pushing up from the earth beneath his feet, and his legs would buckle, and his heart would collapse on itself, and he would long for a swig of the magic potion the Dev had given Baba Ayub so he could forget. But there was no forgetting. Pari hovered unbidden at the edge of Abdullah's vision everywhere he went. She was like the dust that clung to his shirt. She was in the silences that had become so frequent at the house, silences that welled up between their words, sometimes cold and hollow, sometimes pregnant with things that went unsaid, like a cloud filled with rain that never fell. Some nights he dreamed that he was in the desert again, alone, surrounded by the mountains. In the distance, a single tiny glint of light flickering on, off, like a message. He opened the tea box. They were all there. Buddies, feathers, set from roosters, ducks, pigeons, the peacock feather too. He tossed the yellow feather into the box. One day, he thought, hoped. His days in Sadbagh were numbered, like Suza's. He knew this now. There was nothing left for him here. He had no home here. He would wait until winter passed and the spring thaw set in, and he would rise one morning before dawn, and he would step out the door. He would choose a direction, and he would begin to walk. He would walk as far from Sadbagh as his feet would take him. And if one day, trekking across some vast open field, despair should take hold of him, he would stop in his tracks and shut his eyes, and he would think of the falcon feathers what he had found in the desert. He would picture the feather coming loose from the bird, up in the clouds, half a mile above the world, trilling and spinning in violent currents, hurled by gusts of blustering wind across miles and miles of deserts and mountains, to finally land, of all places, and against all wars, at the foot of that one boulder for his sister to find. It would strike him with wonder then, and hope too, that such things happened, and though he would know better, he would take heart and he would open his eyes and walk.